We are pleased to welcome you to our roundtable discussion on writing modern European history. Sonja Levson and Friedemann Pesto, both historians at Freiburg University, will chair the discussion. We are glad and honoured to welcome the editors of 4 European history journals: Quinn Slobodian of Contemporary European History, Ilaria Favretto of the European History Quarterly, László Kontler from the European Review of History, and Miloš Řezník from the Journal of Modern European History. The event is co-organised by the project EuropeDebate and by the History Department of the University of Freiburg. A very warm welcome to everyone both from Freiburg and to all guests from across Europe and beyond. Just a very few words on the project EuropeDebate and on the roundtable. EuropeDebate is a digital project initiated at the universities of Kassel and Freiburg and supported by the Max Weber Foundation and several historical institutes. The project initiated a new historiographic dialogue about modern European history as a field of research. EuropeDebate differs, in our view, from earlier discussions about the field in 2 ways. First, due to its digital character, which allows the debate to evolve continually, and secondly, as it is the first debate on European history where the contributors really do come from all over Europe. 15 countries are represented so far, and this year we will have contributions from several other continents. Contributors discussed European history's place between the challenge of global history on the one hand and the persistence of methodological nationalism on the other, questions of implicit hierarchies, of Eurocentrism and other centrisms within the field. It is in this spirit and following up on these contributions that we organised the roundtable.
My pleasure to briefly introduce our 4 discussants, and I'm doing so in alphabetical order. So first of all, I would like to welcome Ilaria Favretto, who is Professor of Contemporary European History at Kingston University, London. And she's working in the field of European cultural and social history, and in particular, the history of social movements, with a special focus on Italy and Britain. She's author of The Long Search for a Third Way, the British Labour Party and the Italian Left since 1945, published in 2003. She has published further books in Italian and is now completing a work on industrial conflict in 20th century Italy. And since 2018, she has been serving as co-editor of European History Quarterly, the journal she is representing tonight. Next, I would like to introduce László Kontler, who is professor at the Central European University, nowadays based in Budapest and in Vienna. And his research interests lie in the history of political and historical thought in the Enlightenment period, in transnational cultural communication and reception, and the history of scientific knowledge production. Among his several books, I only mention his history of Hungary with the title Millennium in Central Europe, first published in 1999. Then a book titled Translations, Histories, Enlightenments, William Robertson in Germany, published in 2014, and Maximilian Hell and the Ends of Jesuit Science in Enlightenment Europe, that came out in 2020. László Kontler has been an editorial committee member of the European Review of History since 1997, and that's the journal he is representing in our discussion. Our third guest is Miloš Řezník. He is Professor of European Regional History at the University of Chemnitz, and since 2014 the director of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. He specializes in East Central European history, processes of nation building and regionalization, but also in cultural history, the history of social elites and of border regions. He has published several books in Czech, in particular on early modern and modern Poland, but also national histories of several Central and East European countries and regions, as well as a book in German on the aristocracy in Galicia in the late 18th century. And Miloš Řezník is part of the editorial team of the Journal of Modern European History. And to complete our panel, I welcome Quinn Slobodian, who is Associate Professor of History and the Marion Butler McLean Associate Professor in the History of Ideas at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. He works on modern German and modern international history with a focus on North-South politics, social movements, and the intellectual history of neoliberalism. He's the author of Foreign Front, Third World Politics in 60s West Germany, that came out in 2012, and of Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, published in 2018. And Quinn Slobodian serves as the editor of, or one of the editors of Contemporary European History. So thank you all very much for coming together tonight. And to kick off our discussion, I would like to ask our guests to briefly give an idea of how each of your journals understands and approaches European history. And how do you think, from an editor's perspective, the field of European history writing has been changing over the last years? Ilaria Favretto, may I ask you to start giving your opinion?
First of all, thank you for the invite. And I'm very happy to contribute to this roundtable discussion, and very much look forward to the debate and the exchange of ideas with colleagues from other journals and the audience. So let's start from the first part of your question. So our approach to European history. So we know that meanings and of Europe have been changing and evolving a lot throughout time. Very much depending on political and historical circumstances, or the others against whom Europeans have defined themselves. So keeping this in mind, and also because of the chronological span that the European History Quarterly covers, which is from the late Middle Ages to the post-1945 period, we tend to adopt a quite flexible and broad understanding and notion of Europe. So certainly one that doesn't equate with the European Union, but certainly one that goes beyond that. And so we have recently published articles on Iceland, on Albania. We're very keen on continuing publishing work on, or seeing British history represented in our special issues and integrated in articles published. We're very keen on publishing on Russia, although we don't really receive many submissions. But we review regularly books on Russia, and also I'm thinking of other areas. The Balkans is an area where recently we've been able to publish a few articles. So coming to the field, in spite of all the talk of the crisis talk, I think that if one look at the last 20 years, I will say that the field has progressed quite significantly and in the right directions. So we have seen scholars in the field approaching new themes, asking new and broader questions, and addressing the criticism which has been leveled to the field. So the kind of Eurocentric approach, the little attention paid to some areas in Europe. So I think overall the field has become less Western-centric, and for our 50th anniversary, so quite recently, Francis King, who is our book reviews editor, has analyzed our content, and looking at the articles we publish over the last 10 years, he saw that actually there has been an increase of articles on countries which goes beyond the usual suspects and the kind of bunch of countries which dominated the writing of European history. So we published on Denmark, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, just to make some examples. Of course, the national state is still, in terms of focus, is still dominant. But we and I'm sure we will come back to this later in the discussion. But we've also been, I think, in general, the journal and general the field has been able to produce quite interesting work, which is generally comparative and transnational in its approach, and especially special issues are very good at producing that type of work. And certainly if you look at the literature and the wider field, I can think of scholars such as Richard Evans, Donald Sassoon, just to mention a few names, who have really produced genuinely European histories, which kind of go beyond the kind of assemblage of national case studies that very often is regarded as European history. And my last point, I can see also scholars in the field, especially the younger generation, kind of engaging with more and more with the global connections and dimensions. So situating Europe more in the Mediterranean, for instance, exploring links with Northern Africa, the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, or of course also looking at the legacies of empires on European societies and polities. So this is another area which, of course, I've seen it growing, perhaps a bit slowly, but certainly more research has been produced in this area too.
Thank you very much. I would like then to pass on the question to László Kontler, please.
Thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation. I'm very pleased to be a part of this and take the opportunity to congratulate on the excellent blog, which gives a lot of inspiration. Talking about the approach that the ERH, the European Review of History, is taking to European history, identities and approaches are inseparable from histories, as we know. So it must be mentioned that the journal is very much a product of the early 1990s. That is the euphoric times of European integration. In fact, it was born out of a grant which an organization called the European Association of Young Historians received from the European Commission. The association has, its main activity has been publishing this journal, and it still exists as a legal entity. So in any case, it's very much a generational journal. It was and it bore the mark of its creation on its early orientation. Also, it was a critical approach to the kinds of book titles which had the European miracle, etc., on their covers. It was trying critically to assess the European heritage, of which the denouement, the current process and progress of European integration seemed to be. Inevitably, there was obviously some teleology in this, which retroactively or retrospectively I must be acknowledging. Still, I think there was a critical endeavor of exploring European identities from the very outset. And the journal was trying to do this by establishing a platform of communication among various historiographical traditions across Europe, including also communication across generations of historians. And it still cultivates this legacy of trying to provide a platform for emerging generations of historians. So it was very much in tune with a period of time when various book series were also arising, looking into the European legacy, as much as it is shared or as much as it is scarred with fissures. There was a book series which I specifically mean, the famous Europa bauen, Making of Europe, Faire l'Europe, and so forth, in the collaboration of 5 distinguished European publishers. There was also some communication between the journal and the series. As we were going on, obviously we were beginning to take a more skeptical approach on the circumstances among which a journal like this was being published. This can be illustrated by the titles of the conferences which we have organized. The journal has been organizing a number of conferences, partly as a way of promoting itself and partly as a means of recruiting articles. The first big one was called European Identities. That was 2001 or 2002. the 10th anniversary conference. So how the various layers of identities coalesce, converge, or split in Europe between local, regional, urban, national, confessional, etc., etc. The next one, the 20th anniversary in 2012 or 13, was called Declines and Falls, pointing to crises in the process of the making of Europe. And then the 25th one was called Academic Freedom in Historical Perspective. Actually, my university, which was suffering from contemporary developments in that regard, was the host of that one. So the approach is inevitably comparative and transnational, and from the outset, the regional concentration on Western Europe, which for a long time was characterizing European history writing, was being alleviated by inviting, commissioning articles from the East, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and so forth. Now, as regards the problems that I'm a little bit more skeptical than Ilaria has been about the progress that has been made, because I rather see it like an oscillation between opening up and closing down. And indeed, as the organizers of this event were framing the problem, where is European history between national and global? Indeed, one question to ask is how European are European national historiographies? How far the European approach has penetrated national historiographies? Where is Europe in British or French historiography? Global history is very powerfully there. New imperial history speaks a lot about the presence of the formation of metropolitan minds and cultures in Britain, in France, and the main European colonial nations throughout the 18th through the 20th centuries. I do not see as powerfully the presence of the European perspective, how European awareness has been shaping those histories and historiographical traditions. As far as the global and the national and the European is concerned, in the more easterly regions, I mean, in national historiographies, which do not presume to have to deal with the colonial and the imperial legacies of Europe, because they pretend not having to do anything with that. A European perspective is beginning to emerge in those national historiographies without a comparable and compatible emergence of the global perspective there. So I was mentioning, Friedman has kindly mentioned my Hungary book, which was conceived also in that optimistic period of 1990s of European integration, which was aspiring to be European history of Hungary. Now there is a younger generation of Hungarian historians who are putting together a big enterprise about the global history of Hungary, but there's a great deal of resistance among especially contemporary East European historiographies against the global perspective, which also has an impact, interestingly, on their willingness to embrace the European perspective. So although I agree that a great deal of progress has been made in the journal, transnational themes dominate the scene. Now that we are publishing 6 issues per year, thanks to the generosity of the publisher Taylor and Francis, we can afford doing 3 thematic volumes in a year. Already early on in the 1990s, we were trying to include thematic dossiers addressing a selected theme with a small introduction to provide some coherence to each of the issues. Now, these thematic issues, which we publish, have the character of carefully edited collective volumes with a substantial introduction which weaves together the themes across various national case studies, whether about solidarity, whether about Americanization, or about civility as a concept of manners and behavior, etc. Just mentioning a couple of the themes that we have been tackling during the past couple of years. Still, I think there's a long way to go along the lines that I was trying briefly to mention, but I'm talking too much, and there are others waiting their turn.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to ask Professor Řezník to follow up on this next, please. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Can you hear me well now?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having invited me to this roundtable. And as for your question, the first one, in our journal, we are using quite a flexible, not even definition of European history, but understanding of European history, always depending of context, thematical context, and so we have also no connection with institutional understanding of Europe, and I would say is what is very important for us is the contextualization of European history in global context, and that would be also the part of my answer to the second question, because what is really have been changing in last maybe 10 or 20 years after the great discussions of what does European history make up is a kind of maybe it can sound paradoxically a little bit, but a kind of regionalization and at the same time globalization of history, because as long as Eurocentrism was dominant in historical perspective in Europe, in not only European historiographies, so the European history meant the general history implicitly, and only after resigning from this or reflecting this Eurocentric perspective, it was possible to ask not only what European history is, but what is the place and the role of European history in global history? So considering European history or Europe as a region in global context, and that's a certain tension we are moving. So Europe between regionalization, inside regionalization, because sometimes we are concentrating in some thematical context on different European regions like Balkans or Scandinavia or Eastern or Central Eastern Europe and so on, and sometimes we are more concentrated on interferences between Europe and other other global regions or other regions in global in global context. So in my view, or it is my impression that only the reflection of Eurocentrism made it possible to ask or to discuss what European history exactly is and should be. But on the other side, what I believe to have observed in last 10 or 20 years is another approach. So in the 1990s or at the beginning of this century, there was a lot of discussions of what makes up European history, what are the typical or characteristical and symptomatic phenomena and topics of European history. Is it ancient? Is it ancient heritage of ancient history? Is it democracy? Is it liberalism? Is it the heritage of nationalism or nation buildings, as as an European phenomena, or what that is exactly. And there was always the same answer. Well, on the one side, there is no phenomena that would be present only exclusively in the European history. So the question was, the other question was, what is identity? What has our identity building significance for Europe and for European history? Not what phenomena are represented in European history or in the history of European regions and countries and cultures, but how are European societies, national societies in the 19th, 20th century using this mixture of heritage and of phenomena to build or to define Europeanness, I would say, so European identity. So I would say from the actual perspective, present perspective, these debates or discussions are not so actual anymore, and we are approaching the Europeanness of the history of our region more flexible and more depending on the thematical context.
Excellent, thank you very much.
So maybe an approach coined by fluidity, also by fluidity of our perspectives.
Thank you very much. And to conclude this first round, may I ask Quinn Slobodian to share his thoughts with us?
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. And it's an interesting conversation to have, and not one that actually I have occasion to have very often. So I'm representing Contemporary European History. I'm one of 4 editors. We're a fairly new journal. It was founded in 1992. It was founded with, I think, a fairly self-conscious mandate to sort of respond to the post-Cold War moment, to respond to the moment of the deepening and eventually widening of European integration. So it kind of, I think, it distinguishes itself somewhat by being a bit frank about its own presentist concerns. In other words, not having any sort of feelings of the need to disavow present political concerns, but rather embracing them or leaning into them. So there's, on the one hand, I think, this kind of mandate of the journal, which is to say, what matters to us now in this present moment, thinking from Europe, even if not being physically in Europe at all times. But then there's also the kind of pre-circumscribed space of what we consider to be the ambit of articles that we publish. So the as opposed to the other journals mentioned earlier, we don't stretch back to the Middle Ages. We don't even stretch back far into the imperial period. In fact, we sort of draw the line at the beginning of the First World War up to the present, which means we lean heavily toward the present. But then we do sort of say that articles should be anchored somehow in the space of continental Europe, relatively conservatively defined. So there's a bit of a tension that I wanted to begin by sort of drawing attention to, which is that on the one hand, we're saying what matters to us in presentist terms, what guides our interests as historians. But then at the same time, we're saying those things can only happen within this particular space and this particular time period. So there's kind of a contradiction there that I've already felt in my time as editor there for a couple of years. Because what that means is we need to be looking for those things that we find compelling in a presentist sense that happen to also overlap with this approach. Now, I think that the journal does its best when it splits that difference well. For example, there was a big forum about Brexit a couple of years ago that was, I think, very effective. And it was effective because it did those two things simultaneously. It was at the same time something on everyone's mind and something that happened to fall within the space of what could be defined as European history and European politics. At other times, those don't work as well. And I think there's a kind of tendency I've noticed in the journal, which is that there are sort of, on the one hand, the pieces that are interesting for scholars, that approach a thematic topic, such as, you know, the role of nature and environment in recent histories, or the role of infrastructures, or the role of families and family policies. Those tend to be successful, I think, from an academic and sort of scholarly point of view, but they aren't always the most successful in terms of clicks or views. On the other hand, there are those articles that are read the most and linked the most, which tend to fall into specific sort of memory struggles within specific national contexts. So for example, recently, an article about the history of neo-fascist networks in Spain that was picked up by a local journalist, reported on, and that has been, you know, extremely well circulated in the last month or so. It's not at all about transnational this or that, thematic this or that. It doesn't tap into any sort of trendy historiographical trends. It's just like people wanted the dirt on these neo-fascist networks, and so they went to the source to find out about them. Something similar happened with a piece on Portugal under the dictatorship, where a new archival evidence, you know, was found and publicized in this great piece. Local journalists in Portugal picked up on it, and then suddenly it became kind of a sensation. So I've found this already to be an interesting sort of balance to try to strike as an editor. Is like, what kind of pieces do we want most? Do we want those pieces that find their most immediate resonance and purchase in the kind of present political discussions at the moment? Yes, we do. But we also don't want to lose the kind of scholarly mandate and try to figure out ways that we can be kind of, you know, becoming ever more sophisticated in our own understandings of the European past. So those, I think, are the two poles of sort of gravity for the journal at present, and we have different means, which we could also talk about later, of doing that, the different formats, special issues, spotlights, forums, this and that. But I think for now, I just wanted to sort of put that question of sort of scholarly interest versus present political resonance on the table as something that is part of our world right now.
Well, thanks so much. I'll take over then, and we'll now head more squarely for the challenges in the field. And after like elaborating on the aims and on the ideas and on the development of the fields, we would like to ask also for the perceptions of crisis. So Ilaria spoke of the crisis talk, and László Kontler spoke of the enthusiasm of the 90s, which kind of has vanished. So where we are now, is there a crisis or isn't there? What would be your take on it? And to make that a bit more differentiated, is European history maybe in danger of being crushed between a persisting, maybe even renewed focus on national histories on the one hand, and the trend to go global on the other hand? Is that a perception which is reflected by your experience as journal editors? Of course, global history, first and foremost, has given important stimuli, impulses to rethink European history, and this European history cannot be thought without global history now. But isn't it also disruptive for the field in some aspects? For example, global histories of France, global history of Germany, global history of Italy and Spain have appeared, but as László has asked, how European are European national histories? So regarding national history, how transnational, how international is European history really? Shouldn't we strive to make it much more transnational, more international, more comparative, also in its debates? Because also often, as some of you have mentioned, special issues of journals are made up of national examples, and then the introduction tries to wave them together. But does that work? Is that European history? And what are your takes on these? And I would like to start with László Kontler this time.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, now that's something extremely difficult to counter, and I'm not sure how much we can and how much we ought to do about that. And yes, I want to reiterate what Quinn has mentioned, namely that from these nice collections of national case studies, depending on the locality, people tend to pick what seems to be relevant to their national context. And as Sonia, you have mentioned, indeed, it is a function of the introductions that to weave them somehow together. Now, having said that, now that we have the means of tracking the downloads and the views, we tend to see that it is the introductions that received the highest numbers, which may give rise to some cautious optimism. There's still an interest among the readers, students, academics, colleagues, and so forth, in getting something about the larger picture, which is provided by the issue editors on the basis of their own analysis of the individual contributions. Indeed, there is the challenge of global history, which in some cases might obliterate the European accent. But in some cases, it is the repudiation of the global perspective that helps critics of the European endeavor of writing history to repudiate the European dimension of historical writing, historical thinking, and historical awareness. And this is combined also with the processes of national re-entrenchment in contemporary politics. And I very much agree with Quinn again that here the perspectives that we get, or the constraints that we get from the developments of the political scene, are inseparable from what we do in our scholarship. I mean, if you look at the recent pronouncements of some, especially Central and East European political leaders about the irrelevance of the European tradition for building or rebuilding or constructing their own national communities. In fact, the increasing inertia and the increasing depletion, increasing emptiness of the European legacy, which goes hand in hand with the, the rejection of the European legacy goes hand in hand with the criticism of European modern histories on account of their having globalized Europe. Now, this might sound a bit hazy, so let me give an example. In the atmosphere of Black Lives Matter, or in the atmosphere of footballers kneeling down before football games, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who is a well-known football fan and the builder of dozens of football stadiums across the country and even across the borders in Hungarian inhabited territories in Slovakia, Romania, and Serbia, the Hungarian Prime Minister says, we have nothing to do with that sort of legacy. Hungarian men only kneel down in front of God or in front of ladies, but not before other men. And Black Lives Matter does not concern us. Hungary does not share in the colonial legacy, in the legacies with slavery, which is, of course, complete nonsense. I could give many examples of the ways in which the imperial and colonial past infiltrates the lived experience of East Europeans. And that's a legacy, therefore, which needs to be reckoned with. But rejecting that legacy is also an instrument of criticizing the European legacy and the European perspective, which Hungarians / Poles, etc., to our mind, do need to cultivate in developing their own historical awareness. Which brings me to the point that I think as historians, as historical journal editors, we also have the task of dealing with the questions of where history, including European history, is in the public. What means do we have to shape public perceptions of history, of belonging, of identities today, and developing simply realistic and responsible attitudes to the past, which are indispensable for any sound society.
Thank you so much. Ilaria, may I pass on to you? You have been quite optimistic in your first statement. So how would you react to the question regarding challenges?
I must say, yes, I'm definitely more optimistic than László. I share László's concern about the lack of Europe in national historiographies. And I think the examples that you mentioned, László, the French and the British, are good examples. And certainly there is very little Europe in British history, lots of empire, but very little Europe at the moment. But then if one looks at other national histories, and well, certainly the one I know better is Italian history and Italian historiography. There is lots of Europe in the way that scholars have recently been written about Risorgimento, about the nation state formation kind of process. I'm thinking here of the work of Maurizio Isabella, Axel Korner. So I'm kind of less pessimistic about this, and perhaps other countries too. I think certainly Dutch historiography, there is again another example where you can find lots of Europe there. Coming to the challenges and the limitation, which of course I'm aware of. So it's not just these rosy, fantastic pictures. Of course, there are lots of challenges and limitations. And one is what you described in the kind of description of this roundtable discussion as methodological nationalism. It's true that lots of special issues and books on European history are still kind of a sum of national case studies. But it's also true that introductions, as László was saying, very often do a good job in providing readers and specialists in the fields with a kind of larger picture. So the kind of the dominance of the nation state as a focus and as a kind of framework of analysis is still very much a challenge. And we know the reason is the way, the kind of the motives for the dominance is political context, which of course is quite important, but also the way teaching is structured in universities, language barriers, and funding is also a factor. Another clearly, an area where clearly some progress has been made, but still there is a quite long way to go, is of course the coverage of European history. So what European history is, and I can certainly see a very strong persistence of the East and West divide, where lots of comparative and transnational works are still considered Western and Eastern Europe as kind of two separate entities. And so clearly that is also there, and something that the field has not really been able to properly address. In terms of, the danger that global history poses to the field, again, I'm more positive there. I can see this. I see global history as an opportunity for European history to grow, to strengthen itself, to become a more interesting discipline with scholars. And this is an exciting time with scholars, with so much there still to be understood and explored, and with so many new questions and themes that need addressing and approaching. And this has been, all these new questions have been opened up by global history. So I don't see global history replacing European history. It's just kind of an extra perspective which will further enrich our understanding and comprehension of and writing of European history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there's an interesting ambivalence in the fact that, as I said, there's very little European history in British history, and there's, as László said, very little European history in French history. And as European history becomes less westernized, less Western-centric, at the same time, one might say that European history maybe gets a stronger stronghold in Eastern European history than in the traditional Western European historiographies. So maybe it's the old big three, France, Britain, and Germany, who are the problematic cases and who do not really interact with European debates in some extent, while other European historiographies are much more international European in some aspect. Quinn, would you like to jump in?
Sure, I guess I'd like to pick up a little bit about what Ilaria was saying about the kind of material conditions for knowledge production, because I think that's a really important thing to not leave out of the story here. Speaking from the United States, as I am now, the collapse of European history positions is notable. It's something that is not getting any better. And in fact, this is where I think Ilaria's point about global versus European history is not just one that needs to be answered at the sort of intellectual level, but more at the level of human relations and job design. Because the tendency in the United States over the last decade or so has been to absorb the challenge of global history, but do so in such a way that now you can have people who teach both African history and European history for the price of one, right? So this, the acceptance of the global critique has in practice led to the shedding of dedicated European history positions, which one can say is actually a good thing, that, you know, small colleges don't have a European, you know, a Germanist, a French specialist, and a British specialist, and instead have an Indian historian and a Latin Americanist and a choose your European countryist. But that is nonetheless something that, you know, carves away at the number of people who are, you know, employed and who are able to sort of actively participate in the ecosystem that all of us are part of. The material question also comes to bear in some things like review essays, which we have found it harder and harder to find people to write because they're not considered articles for the purposes of a lot of the quantified ways of measuring research output that have now become so important to people's lives. So I think that things like that are important to bear in mind in terms of the constraints we're operating with. I think there's also something that I wanted to mention about the kind of way that European studies as a somewhat separate discipline and field shadows European history. It's been remarked a lot that one of the particularities about Europe post 1989 is that the study of Europe has often been funded by Europe itself, right? One thinks about the proliferation of Jean Monnet chairs and the like. I think that led to an overly sunny depiction of European integration for the first 10 or 15 years up into the first referendums, early 2000s. And now, of course, you know, there's a general sort of pessimism and a loss of kind of optimism about what European integration is. So this sort of the common market boosterism or kind of cheerleader form of historiography has experienced a bit of a crisis. I think that the distinctive status of something like our journal is we are sort of not taking a side in the fight, right? We're neither a cheerleading journal for European integration, nor are we journals that do exist, which see Europe as simply, you know, tarred from its origins, as identified only by sort of racism, exclusion, and xenophobia. So because we kind of take this middle road of how does Europe operate, I think that even though that's become all the more interesting in since the Eurozone crisis to try to figure out how the pieces of Europe actually put pressure on each other, I think it's something that doesn't have the kind of political energy of either praising Europe or condemning it, right? Figuring out how Europe works is something that actually it seems that historians would sometimes rather step away from that challenge and return to the more comfortable space of national historiography in the end. So I think that, I think that there's a kind of, and Miloš mentioned this, there was this sort of turn of the millennium excitement about defining what is Europe that has faded. And I think that the category of European history is not just under kind of intellectual pressure, but also institutional pressure, at least in places like the United States.
Thank you so much. And finally, Miloš, would you like to conclude this round?
Yes, I'm not able to offer a conclusion of our statements, but I would agree with Ilaria in one important point, that I don't see the global history as a danger for European history. As I've already said, you need a kind of, you need to transcend European history to be able to look at the European history, to discuss what European history is and what is it making up. For me, it's quite obvious that there is a kind of crisis of European history, looking at numbers of enrollments in Germany, at least, in such fields of study like European history and European studies at German university. They are lower and lower for at least for decade. But I would say it's normal. It's normal, and especially in Germany, because in Germany, the field of studies at universities and even humanities and research are quite dependent on fashions. And there was a large wave of fashion where European history was very fashionable. It's quite normal in Germany that this wave at the moment is over. So I would not see it so critically from this point of view. But maybe another point or 2 points. I would mention two points. The first one was the problem of the 1990s, where Europe were very fashionable. But in the 1990s, Europe and Europeanness was understood in political context as a remedy to nationalism. Maybe you can remember this slogan, Europe of regions. So Europe and regionality conceptualized as something which is again the nationality, which would be a remedy to a strong national identity. And that was the problem, because the people had the impression, of course, to be more European. So I have to be less French on Poland and so on. In this concurrence between nationality and Europe was a problem. From my point of view, I would even say that the modern nation buildings it's one of features, one of phenomena that are able to be used for definition of Europeans. What is Europe in modern history? Even more, I would say that the nationalism, the concept of nation, or at least political nation, was a typical export article of Europe in the 20th century. Look at the nation buildings in the second half outside of Europe, using exactly the European concept of nations. That would be one point. Maybe we are over these discussions. They are over these discussions, but still sometimes there is an impression or maybe impression or implicit impression that there is a concurrence between national identity and European identity, which is not necessarily the case. The second problem is the end of a narrative. European, so Europe and Europeization and European integration as a success story. 1990s not only from Central and Eastern European perspective. In the 1990s, the story of the whole story and also the program of European integration was told as a positive connoted story of success. And we have a change in this context. The history of Europe is more and more consider it as a way from one crisis to another, at least in the last maybe 15 years. And for this reason, Europe and European integration is not so fashionable and popular anymore as it was. So not anymore. So automatically positively interpreted and connoted, and that's a great problem also for the European for the field of studies, because that was a problem at European universities. Field of studies such European history and above all, especially European studies, have had a theological background. Yeah. More and more integration, and more in common, and that is not so obvious, and it is not so self-understanding in the European development in the last decade. So there is a problem to be solved in the present time.
Thanks so much, Miloš. We have to move on to the last round of questions very quickly.
And after speaking about teleology, perhaps it's now the time to raise also the aspect of diversity, in particular with regard to regions, subjects, and authorship. So in the contributions you have in this journal. And perhaps it might be interesting to discuss what are strategies you as journal editors or your journals are using to increase the diversity of authors, subjects, submissions, and to avoid certain biases towards certain regions, perhaps an over-representation of certain national cases. And how are you dealing with very different European academic culture that might all label themselves as European to some extent, but when it comes to article writing and when it comes to submitting, reviewing, accepting articles, might represent a broad variety of approaches to writing history in a very practical and perhaps technical sense, in particular for authors based at non-English speaking institutions. So as time is progressing, perhaps we might concentrate just on one or two of these aspects of diversity. And may I ask Quinn Slobodian now to go first and share his thoughts with us?
Sure, yeah. And one of the things I've been surprised by is that we haven't had to go out of our way too much to make sure that we get a wide range of submissions. In fact, we do get a lot of submissions from, let's say, not the big three, as it's been talked about in this discussion. In fact, we have a strong, almost over-representation of articles that get submitted from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spanish and Portuguese cases, which is often, quite great, and we're happy to have that. And a lot from Eastern European, let's say Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian topics as well. One of the things that we do to make sure that we don't sort of end up with blind spots is we have this thing called a spotlight feature within the reviews section. And there it's kind of a big ask for scholars, but what they do is they do a kind of a roundup of the recent historiography of a particular region, whether it's Norway or Bosnia is one that's coming out soon. So we try to find people who are often from those regions and can sort of introduce maybe a topic that is not as well known to people from outside those regions. So that's something very pointed that we try to do. One thing that I just wanted to mention in passing then about especially those Iberian and East Central Europe cases is it's striking to me anyway how much the topics of wartime still remain seemingly the most important times to write about: the Second World War, the Spanish Civil War, enormous number of articles about the Spanish Civil War and the resistance against the Spanish Civil War that we get. There's nothing wrong with this, of course. These periods of national trauma and suffering are natural to focus on, but it's noticeable for me as someone who was trained in the United States in European history in the early 2000s, when the emphasis had gone quite a bit away from actually times of war per se, and it was much more interested in everyday life and consumerism, in globalization, economic matters, economic thought. It seems to me that in some of the national historiographies, a lot of these generational issues are still being worked out through questions of conflict and war. And that's something that I've simply, as an observation that I made, which has been interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I think generation is quite a factor that comes up in different fields and different instances also tonight in this discussion. May I then ask Miloš Řezník, what's the situation or the impression from the viewpoint of the Journal of Modern European History?
So for the last series of volumes, I think I can't observe any deep differences in approaches, in cultures, in the text submitted and in the proposals, because every group, every thematic group is international already, and regularly we have to do with authors that are very used to act in international contexts, and they are not so connected with their national academic culture. Of course, there are differences, but differences, I would say, rather on the level of writing, of formulating the text, not in the approaches, or not in the profound understanding of concepts, or even in nationalized views on historical subjects. But to be honest, I'm not always so happy about it, because I think that the very funny in Europe and in European humanities and research are the differences between research, among the research traditions and academic cultures. And this approachment of our style of writing and of our habits, even habits in academia, I'm not sure if it is a very positive phenomenon in every case. So I don't see any large problems in this context.
Thank you very much. Ilaria, I guess for European History Quarterly, the issue of the aspects of diversity and plurality is a challenge you are probably quite used to, as you are also covering quite a broad time span next to the variety of authors with regard to regions and subjects. So how are you dealing with this?
Well, we have seen the number of contributions by authors from outside the kind of Anglophone sphere increasing. So I think I had a look, and it's around 1/3 over the last 10 years of authors are not either from the UK, based in the UK, or the US. So there has been some change, but of course, and clearly, this is not just about European history, but all fields, is internet, social media, cheaper have all kind of facilitated the growth of a closer scholar community and dialogue between historiographies. But it's true that we're still far from, giving space to all the historiographical traditions. So what we do at European History Quarterly, we have a policy whereby we review books, also books published not in English. So we occasionally do that. Of course, is a problem with sometimes publishing houses do not send us the book, and especially now with Brexit, is receiving books from continental Europe has become a bit of a nightmare. But certainly it's up. And also when it comes to for reviews, we try hard with reviewers. So with authors of reviews, with evaluators and referees to kind of reach out colleagues outside the UK or the US, so kind of to diversify our pool of contributors. We also, similar to contemporary European history, we also have review articles, and the aim, kind of, we regularly publish these review articles where the aim is to take stock of historiographical debates and books and works published in languages other than English, which are important for the field. So that's certainly another way to that of kind of fostering this dialogue. But of course, massive barriers still exist. There's language barriers, translation costs, and as Sonia mentioned, is kind of the way articles are structured and written. We have lots of rejects. I will say, this is just kind of my memory, so I don't have exact figures, but my memory is that we have a higher proportion of rejects of articles coming from contributors from outside the UK and the US. And this has to do with the way articles are put together. So the kind of standard format that we expect in journal articles, introduction, engagement with the literature, a certain style, and is simply not there. And very often, you know, that that article, for that article to work and to be published, it will require so much time and energies on our part that we decide to reject it. So clearly those are obstacles, but I can see, again, and this is my last point, to be positive, is certainly access. Now journals can be accessed digitally, so that has made it easier for people not just to publish in journals like ours, but also to access articles. The kind of COVID and the Zoomification of academic debates has certainly also created a space where distances can reduce. So hopefully that will change, and will be not just European History Quarterly, but other journals in European history will be able to diversify more.
Excellent, thank you very much. And may I ask László Kontler to conclude this round of discussion, please?
Yes, thank you. Now, how to ensure diversity? At the ERH, we are trying to capitalize on the lack of a single institutional base. We have multiple institutional bases. Now, to begin with, there was no institutional base at all. There was first a journal, and then there was a publisher, and then there were 3 editorial offices established at the University of Manchester, where the chief of the editorial committee, Bertrand Tate, is based, at the European University Institute in Florence, and at CEU, formerly in Budapest, now in Vienna. There's a much wider editorial board, which is also doing networking for us. We also rely on some kind of talent nurturing. I mean, we work with junior editors, review editors recruited from the range of PhD students at these 3 rather different departments. We also have a translation prize. I mean, each year we announce a translation prize targeting underprivileged, so to speak, languages. These tend to be the small languages of Eastern Europe, and we have the capacity for competent reviewing of the submissions in the mother tongue, which we commission for translation. And this has worked for a couple of years with very good results. We also rely on contact with a series of conferences, which also work in this in order to ensure diversity. I might mention the graduate conferences in European history series, which is also based on the CEU-EUI collaboration together with the University of Vienna and now Oxford. These are annual conferences which recruit PhD students from these 4 institutions and at least as many from outside. So there's a wide diversity of ways in which we are trying to ensure, as you say, diversity, and I think it has worked pretty well over the years. So I think we have a fairly even coverage of authors from various corners. Indeed, as some of my colleagues have emphasized, it's very hard to bring together all the national traditions of academic composition under the single umbrella of the standards of English academic writing. But there are modest means of providing templates, examples, some kinds of quasi-training, as for instance in the case of the Translation Prize submissions. So incrementally, I think, as Miloš was saying, this is not the major obstacle or issue of the transnationalization of European history writing. The reasons lie in structural conditions which have been mentioned by Ilaria and Quinn, even political constraints, which I was mentioning. Just to refer back, just to make things clear, I'm not meaning to say that colleagues, historians in the region do not aspire and do not train themselves as European historians. But the nature of structural constraints arising increasingly from political developments is something that they are already facing, and again, I'm not very optimistic in that regard.
Thank you so much to all of you for this last round in the roundtable discussion. And now we would like to open the floor to the audience and to ask the audience to contribute all the questions. And we already have a few questions in the chat, which we'd like to use to open the discussion. And I would like to just take the first two questions in the chat to read them to you, and then maybe one or two of you can say who wants to answer these questions, to interact or to voice a position. So there's Theo Jung, who asks about the specifics of certain time periods and European history. So he says, are the problems of squeezing European history between the national and the global specific more to modern, or particularly to contemporary European history? And he says, in his impression, early modern history is already more strongly European in outlook, as opposed to modern and as opposed to contemporary European history. And this might even be stronger in medieval or ancient history. So what are the specifics of certain time periods there? And I would like to add directly Pamela Bellinger's questions, adding to Quinn Slobodian's point about material constraints. And she says the relationship of EU funding and the politics of knowledge and the types of European histories produced bear noting here. Which topics are favored by ERC, COAST, etc., and who's included in such projects, and how does that impact the contours of European history? Even the requirement of publication outputs, how does this impact what makes its way into special issues and journals more generally? And just adding a point to our technical assistance, I will stop recording the conversation